So how can we now send data to Firebase from inside this new message.dart file? So from inside this new message state widget here. Well, we're extracting data from that message controller, and therefore we can actually also set this to a final controller here to get rid of these blue squiggly lines. But we are extracting text from it, we're validating it here. To send it to Firebase, we can then again use Firebase Firestore. So this object here provided by the Cloud Firestore package, which we installed before, and which we also used before in auth.dart for storing that extra data. And we can now use exactly the same approach for storing a new message. So we in the end want to get hold of the instance here, then reach out to a collection and to some document to store new data. So here in this new message state class, we reach out to the instance of Firebase Firestore, then to some collection. And here I'll name the collection chat, though the name is up to you. And then here we could create a new document like this, but here I'll instead use a different approach. I'll call the add method to dynamically add a new document, which then does not have a name of my choice, but which instead will have a unique ID as a name generated by Firebase. This add method then takes another map, and that map then again contains these key value pairs that should be stored in Firebase. So the only difference compared to the approach taken in the auth.dart file is that we don't set our own name explicitly for this document, but that we instead go with an automatically generated name. This automatically generated unique ID that will be created by Firebase. Now, the data that should be stored in this document, of course, should be the entered text, but also some additional metadata. But I'll start with the text. Store it under a text key, though that key name is up to you. And it's the entered message that should be stored here. But in addition, I also want to add a created at field to store the current timestamp. And for that, we can use the timestamp class, which is built into Dart, and then use now to use the current timestamp. And in addition, I want to store some user data, like the ID of the user to whom this message belongs. So who posted this message. And to get information about the currently logged in user, we can use Firebase auth again. This Firebase auth thing, which we set up before in auth.dart. So we again want to use Firebase auth, this Firebase auth object, which is available as soon as we add this Firebase auth import here. And then again, we can use .instance to get hold of the globally managed instance. And the convenient thing about Firebase auth is that it does not just give us these methods for creating users or for logging users in. Instead, it also gives us access to the currently logged in user if we have one. And of course, here we know that we will have one on this chat screen because we only reach this chat screen if we are logged in. So this gives me access to the currently logged in user. And then here on user ID, I can use user.uid to get the unique ID of the currently logged in user. Now here I just need to convince Dart that current user will not be null by adding an exclamation mark. And again, as mentioned here, we know that this shouldn't be null because unauthenticated users shouldn't be able to even reach this screen. So with that, we can get the user ID. But then here, I actually also want to store the username so that we can easily show that next to the message when we're outputting the messages later. And I also want to store the user image so that we also have that image URL readily available when we need it. Now that data, username and user image, of course wasn't stored with help of Firebase auth. Instead, we stored it manually with the Firestore package. Therefore, now to access it here, we need to retrieve it from Firestore. And this can also be done through Firebase Firestore instance. And then there, we again reach out to a collection. the users collection in this case, because that's the collection we also used for storing the data. And then we want to reach out to the document that belongs to the user with this ID. So therefore, again, we can use doc and then user.uid to get hold of that document, which we know contains the data we're interested in. And then Firestore gives us a get method, which then in the end will send an HTTP request behind the scenes to Firestore to retrieve the data stored in this document in this collection, which in this case will be that user data that we stored there. Now get in the end returns a future, which then in the end will give us access to the fetched data. Therefore here, to use async await, I'll add async here on this submit message method. And then we can await this here. So here we get the user data by awaiting this get request here in the end. And then here we can set username equal to user data. And then this actually is a so-called document snapshot, which is a type of data provided by Firebase. And this object has a data method, which we can call to in the end get access to the actual data that was stored in the document as a map. We have to add an exclamation mark to convince Dart that this will not be null. It could be null if we're trying to fetch data for a document that doesn't exist, for example. But here we know that we have an authenticated user and therefore it will exist. So we can add the exclamation mark here. And then we'll be working with that map. So we can use square brackets, as you learned in this course, to access the different values for the different keys that make up the map. And then here it's the username key, which I want to access to get the username value. And I'm using username as a key because I used username as a key for storing that data. And I used image URL for storing the image URL data. Therefore, for retrieving that, we would use user data with an exclamation mark and access image URL like this. And that will retrieve this extra data from Firebase Firestore. Now we could also be storing that extra user data locally on the device, maybe just in memory, for example with Riverpod, but here I'm deliberately using this remote solution using Firestore, even though it leads to this extra HTTP request being sent whenever we submit a new message, but I'm using this so that you also see how data can be retrieved from Firestore, because that's of course also something you should know. With that, we're getting the data, we're then using it to send it back to Firestore combined with the entered message. And therefore now with all that out of the way, if we save that, reload, and make sure we're logged in with a user where we did submit that extra data to Firestore. So if that's all true, we can now enter a new message, like a test message, submit it, and now here, we should actually see a new collection if we reload this, a chat collection with one new document, and this title was generated automatically by Firestore, by Firebase in the end. And in there, we see that submitted data. The username, the user image, the ID, but of course, most importantly, also our message. So that's all working as it should. Now, the last thing I want to do is I want to make sure that once I send a message, I don't just reset the input, but I also close this keyboard. And this can be done by going here in my code after clearing my message controller. And then here we can use the focus scope object provided by Flutter of context and then call unfocus. And in the end, this will close any open keyboard by removing the focus from the input field. Now here I'm getting some blue squiggly lines because I'm using context after async await. We could work around that as we did earlier in the course, or we simply move that to the beginning of this async method because indeed I am happy with closing this right away. Maybe here after validating the input, because we don't need to keep this open whilst the message is being sent. Instead, closing it immediately is just fine. Indeed, we can even clear the input there already, because even though the data was not sent yet, we definitely don't want the user to send the same message twice because they think that something went wrong. So clearing this immediately and losing the focus immediately makes a lot of sense before then the data is sent behind the scenes. So now with that, if we reload this, I can send another message. And now you see this is closed, this is cleared, that looks good. And of course, these messages all show up here on the backend. And that's how data can be sent to Firestore and how it can be read from Firestore. And now that we know how to read it, we can of course next work on the chat messages and make sure that we load all the chat messages to then show them in a list of messages in this widget.